The Legend of Zelda is my favourite video game franchise of all time, and my favourite thing about them are a little thing called dungeons. Every Zelda game has these dungeons, and for most games in the series, these are places you'll be at the most. Most dungeons throughout the series have different themings, except for Breath of the Wild, and dungeons are some of the things I look forward to most when playing through a Zelda game. So which do I think are the best in the series? Well, that's what I'll be covering in today's video. I'll be explaining why these are my favourite in the series and will be ranking them. However, before we begin, I do have to say a few things. Firstly, no game will have more than one dungeon representing it on this list. For this list, I have restricted myself to a dungeon per game. I want to be able to appreciate dungeons across all 3D Zelda titles, so each dungeon I choose is my personal favourite from these games. Finally, this is my opinion. I'm not saying that anything here is a fact and that you're wrong for disagreeing. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's start this video. The Stone Tower Temple. The final dungeon in Majora's Mask. This dungeon is truly one of the best in the series. Everything about it screams Majora's Mask. It's mysterious, strange and otherworldly. Imagery of Majora is seen upon its many walls. The theme is eerie, and it upholds the feeling of dread felt throughout the rest of the game. Not only that, but the instruments used in the theme are the instruments used by all playable races: an ocarina, a trumpet, a guitar, and drums. This links to the dungeon's gimmick of using the elegy of emptiness to hold switches down, creating clones of yourself, and the fact that all transformation masks are required to progress through the dungeon. However, that's not all the dungeon offers. Upon obtaining the light arrows, this dungeon gets 10 times crazier. By shooting the red ruby at the entrance, the entire dungeon flips on its head. Literally. This one simple thing can throw you off completely and makes this dungeon one of the best in the series. So, if I love this dungeon so much, why is it at number 5? Well, even though I think this dungeon is amazing, there is one small problem. The boss fight. In both versions of the game, the boss fight is god awful, especially in the 3DS remake, which is the one I've played the most and am most familiar with. In both versions, this boss is slow, boring, and thematically off-putting compared to the rest of the dungeon. The rest of this dungeon is wacky and strange, yet this boss fight is big, bombastic, and for some reason is located in the middle of a desert. It's not very unique, and quite disappointing compared to the rest of the dungeon. However, that being the only flaw should tell you how good this dungeon really is, so that's why it's in my number 5 spot. The Forsaken Fortress. Your first step into the world of Wind Waker. This is one of the only Zelda dungeons you visit twice, once at the beginning of the game and once at the end. Upon entering this dungeon for the first time, you are powerless. Your weapon is ripped away from you, and you're forced to sneak around its many halls. I particularly like hiding under barrels as you hide from moblins. It's a fun feature that they included. The best part about the first time you go through is that there is no boss. Link is so powerless and weak at this point. The big burb picks him up in his mouth and chucks him away, never to be seen again. Until he comes back with a big, shiny new sword. The second time you go through, it's crazy. You feel way more powerful than before. You literally have the Master Sword. Link runs through and absolutely slaughters everything in his path. He fights the mini-boss Phantom Ganon and just steamrolls through the dungeon. The dungeon item is a skull hammer, which is alright. It's not the coolest item in the game, but you do use it to smash the big burb's head in! This dungeon shows you how much you have progressed through the game by actually allowing you to actually fight the Halmarok King, and upon defeating him, you go into a small room at the top of the dungeon. Standing menacingly inside is Ganondorf. The game pulls a genius move and immediately makes you feel powerless again. You stand absolutely no chance against him. He is the King of Evil after all. The thing I like about this dungeon, and why I think it's one of the best in the series, is the way it makes you feel. It allows the player to truly see how far they've progressed through gameplay. At the start of the game, you are restricted. You can't attack your enemies and you are forced to hide. However, upon returning you are more powerful, you are flexible. However, it doesn't let you become too powerful. It sets up the next half of the game perfectly, and it gives you an incentive to keep playing. The Forest Temple. Yeah, you knew this was going to be on the list. When I first played this game, I was very young, and I distinctly remember the first time entering this dungeon. For months I had been stuck as Child Link, not knowing where I was going or what I was doing. However, I finally did it. I could finally progress with the game. I became Adult Link, immediately went to get Epona. After riding around for a bit, I finally decided to progress with the story. Upon entering, the theme starts playing, and I immediately knew that this dungeon was different. The Forest Temple is a somber dungeon, an ancient fortress from a people long gone. It's become overgrown with plant life and is now inhabited by the undead. This dungeon is what I like to consider the first real dungeon of the game. The puzzles start to get harder, the paths through the dungeon branch off, and progression is locked behind small keys. The enemies you face also become more threatening. Your first enemy is literally a Wolfos, which is very difficult to face if you don't know what you're doing. Not only that, but the boss is one of the best. It's literally Phantom Ganon. Do I need to say any more? Snow Peak Ruins. Yeah, this is my second favourite dungeon. Everything about it is just derpy, yet also mysterious at the same time. It's a very odd mix. Upon first entering the dungeon, you are met with the entrance to this old ancient mansion. Paintings hang around the room and depict other dungeons throughout the game, and characters including Raru. Large metal armour decorates the entrance. The sense of mystery hits you. You approach the door and enter the next room, and suddenly, the dungeon becomes extremely derpy. There's a Yeti sitting by a fire in a jumper so it can keep warm. Who thinks of this sort of thing? This Yeti is called a Yetta, and she has the Mirror of Twilight you're looking for, so she sends you all around the mansion in search of the key, marking places on the map she believes it's at. However, she always sends you to chests that have food inside. You can take this food to her husband, Yeto, in the kitchen, and he will cook up some nice soup for you before you head back outside into the cold. Nintendo, what on earth were you on when making this? Although I love the derpiness of this dungeon, I also love the mystery. Who used to live here? Why is it abandoned? And why do the suits of armour look like they were not made for humans? This dungeon is a gold mine for Zelda theories. You knew this one was coming. No matter your opinion on Skyward Sword, everyone can universally agree that this dungeon is great. The theming of this dungeon is probably the best throughout the entire series. I believe it takes a lot of inspiration from Buddhism. The entrance to the dungeon is in the upper levels. It's peaceful, calm and relaxing. It's very odd, to be honest. Most Zelda dungeons are dark and gloomy, however this is warm and bright. In a way, it makes it off-putting. It puts you on edge. This is also helped by the music as well. But this is not all the dungeon offers. Around the halfway point, you fall deep underground. The music slows. It's dark. Suddenly, it's no longer bright and colourful. It's even darker than most Zelda dungeons. Down in this underworld, there is a strange purple liquid that can kill you upon contact. Zombie bokoblins stumble around, desperate to attack you. However, eventually you come across this beam of light from above. Coming from this beam of light is a long piece of string. Link begins to climb, and as he approaches the top, the zombie bokoblins follow, climbing up after him, attempting to bring him back down. This is one of the few moments in the Zelda series I would call horror. It's truly that off-putting and creepy. Now, this moment would not be as significant to me if it didn't have some context from the real world. In fact, it's actually inspired by a Buddhist story called The Spider's Thread. I'll summarise it here, but I recommend reading it yourself after the video. It's only a short story, so it won't take too much of your time. It was a normal day in heaven, and Buddha was standing by a pool. In the pool there were many flowers. Buddha noticed that through the flowers under the water there was hell. One of the people he saw in hell had been a very evil man in life. However, once in his life, he had been good. He was about to kill a spider, but stopped himself and let it live. Buddha decided that the man was to have a chance to go to heaven, so with the help of the spider of heaven, he dropped the spider's thread into the hell below. The evil man couldn't believe his eyes and began climbing up the thread. The distance between heaven and hell was very large, so it was a hard climb for the man. Eventually, he felt tugging below him and noticed that others had begun climbing up the thread too. The thread wouldn't have been able to hold all of them, so he began shouting at them, telling them to get off. The thread snapped and they all fell back down to hell. That's just a quick summary of the story of the spider's thread, and this piece of background context for the dungeon elevates my opinion on it as a whole. Now, the final thing I want to bring up is the amazing boss. It's so much fun. Ripping into the boss's heart with a big sword, it's so satisfying. Not only that, but the inspiration behind it is also interesting. According to the Zelda wiki, it is inspired by Asura, sticking to the Buddhism theme. Due to all these reasons, the Ancient Cistern is my favourite dungeon throughout the entire series.